Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the next installment of our 2023 speaker series, Sotterley Presents People and Perspectives. My name is Nancy Easterling, and it is my honor to serve as the Executive Director of Historic Sotterley. If you were able to join us for the kickoff event this year, it took place in February, the birth month of Agnes King Callum. And that was where we had our part one of Forward Together, where we honored the memory of this woman who was a trustee, a descendant, and who helped pave the way for where Sotterley is today. Tonight, we are going to honor her dear friend, also Trustee Emeritus, and part two of Forward Together, John Hanson Briscoe. We are so grateful to both of them because they are the reason Sotterley has progressed the way it has today. I want to thank all of our donors, members, and sponsors who help us put on events not only like this, but all of the programming and the events that we do at Sotterley. We simply couldn't do it without you. I want to thank in particular the National Trust for Historic Preservation for their Telling the Full History grant, and also for companies like Boeing that support our work in equity. Now, tonight, the event is going to be moderated by my dear friend and colleague, Sam Baldwin, who has, by the way, he chairs more committees on Sotterley than I care to say, but who was the author of an incredible work, the John Hanson Briscoe Historical Project. John Hanson's son-in-law is Sam, and Sam, when his father-in-law was declining, he realized this legacy needs to be preserved. This is available for anyone who wants to go on the Baldwin, Briscoe, and Steinmetz website. I hope that you take advantage of it. You'll learn not even more facts about John Hanson, but you'll learn about Sotterley and about Agnes as well. Tonight, joining Sam, we have Michael Whitson, who was our Trustee Emeritus, Sotterley Fellow, and honestly, I think Sotterley's longest standing champion and leader. Thank you so much, Mike, for being here tonight. We have Jan Briscoe, the daughter of John Hanson, and also the president of our board, and of course, a Sotterley descendant. We have the Honorable Jim Kenney, a Sotterley Fellow, Judge of the Court of Appeals, and our neighbor just around the corner from us. We have Gwen Bankins, who is a descendant, our secretary of our board, and is the head of our preservation, restoration, interpretation, and the man who really needs no introduction, but I will let Sam do his full introduction, our great friend, Senator Ben Cardin. And I just want to say one thing, Senator, in the years that I have known you, I have seen in you the same leadership style I saw in John Hanson. You lead not with ego, but with real care, concern, and for all those you serve. And it is just an honor that you are joining us tonight. So before I hand it over to Sam this evening, I would like to just ask all of you who are joining us, if you can sign into the chat, let us know where you're joining us from tonight. We would appreciate it. And anytime during the evening, if you have a question, start entering them into the separate Q&A button at the bottom. We will take as many questions at the end as time allows. So with no further ado, let me turn this over to my dear friend and our moderator for the evening, Sam Baldwin.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Senator Cardin, for joining us. Having interviewed John Hanson in the last year of his life and reflecting on his political career, I think that the person that he would most like to be with and talk to tonight or hear from tonight would be Senator Cardin. They served together in the House of Delegates in the 1960s into the 1970s. John Hanson told me that most of his success, Senator, actually came from you, that you were the brains that allowed him to succeed on economic matters. And of course, with your skill, you followed him as Speaker of the House of Delegates when he left the House of Delegates. Senator, I'm not going to take up any more of your time. It's an honor to have you with us tonight. What can you tell us about your time with John Hanson?
Well, first of all, Sam, thank you very much for those very kind comments. I don't think John said it exactly that way, but thanks for cleaning up his language so that it sounded really good. And Nancy, comparing me to John Briscoe in demeanor and style is one of the highest compliments I could ever receive. It was 1967, and I was elected to the Maryland General Assembly from Baltimore City. And I didn't know John Hanson Briscoe very well at all. In fact, we had very little dealings during my first 4 years. He was on the Environmental Committee. I was on the Ways and Means Committee. And quite frankly, I watched him from a distance. We didn't have too many issues that we were working together, but he had a reputation of just being a Southern gentleman and a very collegial person who really wanted to get to know everyone and wanted to work together. His committee was well known as one of the more respectful committees in the General Assembly, and that he had just a great reputation. Fast forward 4 years, and I learned that I was going to become vice chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and lo and behold, John Hanson Briscoe was going to become chairman of the committee. So in 1971, we began working very closely together. And what I found really remarkable about him is that he found a way and to use as he talked, as he would say, he would use the power of persuasion and mediation. He felt it was very important to let everyone have an opportunity to get their point across. So on our committee, we had liberals from Baltimore City, we had conservatives from the Eastern Shore, we had libertarians from Western Maryland, we had reformers from Montgomery County, and we didn't have, in those days, the caucuses or the cliques that you see in American politics today. We didn't have that. Instead, we had members who had very powerful views about different things. And what John Hanson Briscoe was able to do is give each of us an opportunity for persuasion so that we could get our issues brought forward and try to get them adopted. And then he gave us the forum for mediation so that we could get results done. And that was just a unique talent during that period of time. And it was a period in which we were able to get some really major bills done for the people of Maryland. Those skills would be so helpful today in American politics. So the Washington Post said, quoted John Hanson Briscoe as saying, "I'm a great believer in getting things done by convincing people of the wisdom of it rather than by asserting power." Think about that for a moment, because that's John Hanson Briscoe. It's that Southern roots that he has, that he feels that we all need to listen, but he had the leadership to get things done. He homogenized the views and came out with a product that everyone felt good about, whether you're a conservative or whether you're a liberal. What I like about him is his passions. You know, he always wanted to make sure that people knew that he was representing Southern Maryland. Southern Maryland was known to be a rather conservative area, so John Hanson Briscoe would let it be known that he was he subscribed to conservative views, but we all know better. He got his first start as a reformer in Southern Maryland, and he always had that little bit of spark in him that really challenged the status quo, that we could do better. And that passion came through so often. He was a fierce advocate for civil rights. And I must tell you, I felt that was his roots in Southern Maryland. I think Southern Maryland has really been the bedrock of passion for civil rights in our state. And he certainly represented that. And then he had a passion for history and for the heritage of Southern Maryland. His background at Sotterley is well known. We know the history of enslavers and enslaved. He embraced the fact that history needs to be preserved and told. And he was very much proud of his family history. We all know that he's a descendant of John Hanson. He told me that about 1,000 times. So we recognize that, but we also know that his great-grandfather was owner at Sotterley. So he was proud of that. He was proud of his roots in Southern Maryland, and he wanted to make sure that story was preserved and told. And he did so many things to protect environmental historic preservation, Point Lookout State Park, Sotterley being designated as a National Historic Landmark, St. Clemens Island. And of course, he was very proud of the fact that St. Mary's represents our first capital. he always had a little bit of a concern about why we were going to Annapolis rather than Southern Maryland as the capital of our state. But he got over that over time. He really was an inspiration to all of us. And I mean, he loved the environment. He loved the environment of Southern Maryland. He really taught me about stuffed ham. Coming from a Jewish community in Baltimore, that was a little bit foreign to me, but he convinced me it was worth eating. I asked him about whether it had been gone through the food inspectors. He said, "Don't ask that question." So he was very proud and of the region that he represented, and he was passionate about education. What he did for the College of Southern Maryland. He had the ability to bring us together. And I must tell you, my success today, and I appreciate what John, how you reported what John said about me, but my success today in large measure was a result of being mentored by Hanson Briscoe. He just taught me the respect of other people, to respect the system, and to recognize people have different views, but there's no reason why we can't work together and get things done. And his contributions to Maryland are certainly very, very, very strong. And there are many people like me that owe our success in politics in large part because of having the great fortune of serving with Hanson Briscoe.
Senator, thank you for those remarks. And we've been the beneficiaries of all your years of service in Annapolis and in Washington, D.C. We all wish you well in your continued endeavors up there, wish you good health, and thank you.
Well, thank you all. And thank you for what you're doing now to acknowledge Hanson Briscoe, a great Marylander, and a great son of Southern Maryland.
Have a good evening, Senator.
Thank you.
Bye.
Our next speaker will be Mr. Mike Whitson. Mike Whitson and Hanson shared a career in real estate. Mike owning a title abstracting company in Leonardtown, and Hanson in his professional career being a real estate attorney. But they also have a bond in the history of serving Sotterley during some very dark years when there was a question of whether Sotterley was going to survive. Mike Whitson was there with Hanson, and they did turn the fortunes around. So Mike, if you would, tell us how you and John did that.
Well, thank you, Sam, and thanks to Ben Cardin. I thought Ben really captured an awful lot of John and what's important about him. As I've thought about John's work in the community and also as part of Sotterley, it's just an amazing range of people that he knew and was able to work with. If you think about the number of different governors John had a great relationship with and able to work with, the state and federal people. One of the very first things that John was able to help us do was and it had to do with his friendship and his relationship to people like Mike Miller and to Louis Goldstein, to be able to begin the process of engaging the state with Sotterley and helping us show how important it was and to create that kind of synergy. And Ben again really captured John's style really well, that collaborative sense of putting pieces together. He was just so remarkably well thought of and respected and liked by people. One of the things John knew that he was not great at was asking people for money. He just didn't like that, just into his nature. But he knew it was important, and he was very happy to help that happen. And the relationship between our friends like Ben Cardin and Paul Sarbanes and Steny Hoyer, along with the state representatives and the governors, was really extraordinary. He didn't serve directly in the House when Paris Glendenning was governor, for example, but Governor Glendenning was just as important as anyone to Sotterley's success. And John's relationship with him came through friends such as John Griffin, who was the secretary of DNR, who was good friends with the governor. And John instinctively knew the kind of things that the governor cared about. And his background as a lover of the environment gave him a real credibility and really showed Governor Glendenning how important that was. And that was integral to what the governor did for us. You see, we're looking at pictures with Governor Glendenning. John also really knew how to thank people well, in an honest, in a genuine sort of way. There's a photograph there of Agnes and the governor and other people there. In the background, there's Jan Briscoe, lots of other elected officials. And that was an event we did in Annapolis as a way to thank the governor and other people in state government. And John did it in a way that was just really genuine. And he was able to bring all those sort of elements together. He instinctively knew the kind of programs and things that mattered to Governor Glendenning. For example, having been a history professor, he knew that mattered to him. Preservation was important at a time. John saw Southern Maryland was exploding at the time with the growth at the Naval Air Station, the number of people, employees, the companies that were happening there. But John recognized that sort of balance, and he was able to enlist. There's a photograph here with the commissioners and people from the Department of the Interior. I mean, there wasn't an element of public life that John couldn't touch and couldn't bring people's concerns and support to. So that was remarkable. And I just have to think about on a personal level. I mean, going and doing those kind of things with John was such a pleasure because he was so well liked and respected. And he just, we spent a fair amount of time in Annapolis talking with people in the legislature. And if I recall correctly, after John left the speakership, he did not go back to Annapolis very often for a while. Jim Kenney probably knows this better than I do. But when he did return and began to go up in particular for things about Sotterley, it was like he had never left. The kind of affection that people held for him from the people who ran the building. I mean, I'll just always remember the people who actually ran the building, the secretaries and the committee chairs and people like that, the staffers. They knew John well and they had tremendous respect for him. So his ability to, and John acted that way as a judge. It was just in his nature to have that kind of sensibility that Ben Cardin talked about.
Thank you, Mike. Is that it?
Well, for the time being, sure, we can come back. I think it would be interesting. Jim Kenney can, I think, elaborate on an awful lot of that, but it is worth, I'm sure Nancy said that, but the breadth of these photographs here is pretty remarkable, looking at all the people involved. And he was as natural in front of a camera and talking to the New York Times as he was speaking with his friends in a committee hearing or walking around Sotterley. His ability to get along with everyone in a way that was genuine. It wasn't this sort of forced hail fellow well met. It was just he had that kind of rapport with people that was really genuine and human. And as Ben said, to work with John was to learn from him and to enjoy that. And it's just one of the pleasures of my life to have been his friend. And I'm really glad for that. I'm glad for your father, Jan.
Thank you, Mike. So our next guest speaker will be Jim Kenney. Most of you know, of course, John Hanson was born in St. Mary's County. Jim Kenney crossed the Chesapeake Bay coming here from the Eastern Shore at the behest of a index card posted on a bulletin board up in Washington, D.C. that said something along the lines of "Town needs an attorney." Jim Kenney came to Lexington Park to serve as their only attorney at the time. Jan Briscoe was an attorney in Leonardtown, and over the next few years, they saw the benefit to both of them of forming a partnership. That partnership would eventually lead to what became known as the Judge Factory, 7 of those lawyers becoming judges. Jim Kenney, currently a retired judge on what we used to call the Court of Special Appeals. Jim, you had a front row seat watching John rise up through politics, the evolution of your law firm, and both of you being involved in the community here. What can you tell us about John?
Well, I can tell you when the day I first met John was a Saturday on a Memorial Day weekend. And I had, as most lawyers in St. Mary's County did at that time, had Saturday hours. So I was in the office, and along about 10:30 or so, a fellow walks in the door, hand extended, said, "Hi, I'm Jan Briscoe. just wanted to come down and say hello. So we spent, I think there was some coffee involved. It was still early. And we talked for about an hour, and we seemed to get along really well. And we actually talked about, we both maybe needed, an office or a contact in, Lexington Park and Leonardtown. John was in the legislature at the time, so there was a time when he was actually around or not around in his office, and having to catch up with that on Saturdays. It would seem, I think, to most people now that the distance between Leonardtown and Lexington Park is not that great. I calculated it about 11 miles. But the days before having fax machines and email and things like that, having to go back and forth to Leonardtown from Lexington Park on a pretty much daily basis was a problem. So John and I didn't rush into anything, although we spent a lot of time together. It took us about 2 years to work out our partnership. But we got it done. We spent a lot of time socializing during those 2 years after work, and I won't say that our arrangement was consummated in the Roost, but the Roost was the spot for a lot of meetings, some of which we never really got down to talking business. Everything that's been said about John is absolutely true. He had a sense of what was right, what was fair, had a great common sense of looking at an issue and trying to find the right answer for that. Did we always agree on everything? No, we did not. But I don't think we ever really had an argument about that. Ultimately, we would find consensus. We both realized that as our respective practices were building, we actually needed another lawyer. And so we hunted around for one, and then we decide, well, maybe we need a second one. The second one turned out to be Marvin Kamenetz. So the firm went from Briscoe and Kenney to Briscoe, Kenney, and Kamenetz fairly early on. We didn't have a very complicated business relationship. I don't think our first agreement was actually in writing, not what we would recommend to clients, but the theory was that whoever was best suited to handle a case would be the one to handle it. We would try to pick, the best person to do that. Hopefully we would get the bills paid at the end of the month. And if anything was left, we would just split it evenly and go from there. Over time, the firm grew, and there was a lot more paperwork involved and that sort of thing. But what I remember the most, and Jan is on here, and she may remember a lot of this. We really had a good time together.
Yeah.
And you don't have to tell stories, Jan. But we worked hard. We probably played hard, and sometimes I'm not sure our kids could tell the difference between when we were working and when we were playing. I see a screen. We had like a biannual party for clients and friends, and it was on the beach, what we called Briscoe Beach at that time. They were great parties, lots of fun. Invite clients, invite other people to do that. we steamed manos or soft shell clams, and if there were any left, John and I would make chowder the next day. We would also sleep on the beach because one of our clients provided a potty party or porta potty, and but we had to guard it at night. We just couldn't leave it there on that. So we would build a fire and sleep on the beach, and hopefully the sun came up the next day, and then we would clean up. There were very few weekends and things like that that we just didn't spend together doing things. But you know, eventually all three of us became judges, and so we were colleagues again in another situation. What I liked about John was, and I think Ben commented on this, and Mike did too, he was extraordinarily fair and very balanced in dealing with people. Now, I've said before, one thing I think John really liked about me, and at least in the beginning, I could remember the names of his constituents, some of whom were actually relatives. And because John had gotten into the habit of, you know, if you were a male, he might call you sport. And if you were a female, he might call you darling. And then as they would walk off, he'd say, "Who is that?" And I would remember one time I said, "Well, John, that's a cousin of yours." And so, you know, we took it well, and we, you know, it worked well. It was the right thing when the courthouse in Leonardtown was named the John Hanson Briscoe courthouse. I think anybody that had a case before John, whether they won, whether they lost, they came out thinking they were heard and understood, and they were fairly treated. And that's the most that I think that we can ask in the judicial situation. So.
Thank you, Jim. You know, in addition to both of you being judges, and I know that you've been a professor down at St. Mary's College, teaching for many, many years. Where did you and John get your shared sense of contributing to the community outside of your legal profession?
Oh, that's a tough question, Sam. I'm not sure. I haven't taught at the college since this afternoon. I always thought that if I hadn't, you know, gone into the law, that I might like to, you know, be a college professor. I had a picture of tweed jackets and those little elbow pads and smoking a pipe and that sort of thing. And I actually thought I might want to teach English literature. I got a call one day from the president, and I had shared the fact that I thought I might like to teach sometime, and she asked me if I was kidding. And I said, no. And I'm thinking, boy, I could wear my tweed jacket and whatever. She needed somebody to teach political science. There's the beginning of the story. I guess I've been teaching political science courses down there, well, since 1964. So John and I both went to liberal arts colleges, small liberal arts colleges. In fact, we both dated women from Hood College, but we didn't know each other then. So we probably passed each other on Saturday nights from one time or another. But I just think it was just part of us. In terms of public service, I think it's what we thought we were supposed to do. And not just for business, but because that was part of what we brought to the table.
Do you think if John were not a politician or a lawyer, he might find happiness simply being on the farm?
I think he might have, Sam, but I'm not sure of that. John and I talked about retirement, which obviously I've failed at miserably, but we thought we would like to be deckhands on a fishing charter boat. And that sounded like that would be a pretty cool gig on that. John was very particular in some things, like how tall grass ought to be when it gets cut, and how every piece of machinery needs to be kept up to date all the time. I'm not sure that, I think the farm was relaxing. But if there was hay in the field and started to rain, there were many times that we're all out in the field, throwing bales of hay on a truck, trying to get it in the barn before, the rain got there. I'm not sure whether that would have been, what he wanted to do, but he liked it very, very much. And that photograph that I think passed by a while ago, when that was one of the invitations to our party, not that one, but I had on, looked like I was a surveyor because I was doing a lot of construction law and that sort of thing at the time. John has his pitchfork there, and Marvin, who did most of our tort work, was obviously has on medical garb. He's wearing scrubs, and that was our invitation that year to the party. I must admit, when I see those photographs, I really have to smile because they were really fun.
Well, Jim, I'll leave it with this comment on this photo. Of course, John was the only boy in his family, and he would often say not only that you and Marvin Kamenetz were his closest friends, but the two of you, the three of you, were the brothers you didn't otherwise have. And there was that bond.
Yeah, neither of us had a brother. Marvin and I were single kids on that. John had three sisters, but no brother. It was, I don't know if there's perfection, but it was almost perfect the way we were able to get along.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's been a pleasure. Our next speaker is going to be Gwen Bankins, and Gwen had the opportunity to work with John at the courthouse, I believe, when Gwen was with the state's attorney's office. That might have been the first contact between the two of them. John was a judge then. Gwen is currently the secretary on the Sotterley board, but her connections with Sotterley go further back. And I'll start with this photograph right here. Gwen, take it away.
Yes, Judge Briscoe has always been a gentleman, and I started working at the state's attorney's office when Walter Dorsey was the state's attorney, to give you a time frame there. And at that time, the domestic violence laws were changing, so criminal justice advocacy was something. It wasn't new, but in our county, it was just something where we were really trying to get it right. And I'm very thankful for all the judges because they were approachable. So to help you to create that job, to be able to take care of your community, Judge Briscoe had an open door, as did all of the judges. And just to have a sit down conversation, answer questions. I started on the civil side, so coming into the criminal side was an experiment. But Walter Dorsey approved me to come in, and Judge Kenney, Judge Kamenetz, all of the judges were very welcoming to me. And so I did not really know that the Briscoe family were the owners of my family when they were enslaved. And Agnes Valen told me to be connected after college, and I was. And it was actually at the event in 2000 that you showed the picture when we became a National Historic Landmark that it really clicked, that someone I had been working with over 10 years in the community family actually owned my family when they were enslaved. And his daughter Jan and I were sitting on the trial court judicial nominating commission together. And that really makes you, it puts you at a crisis at that moment, because it's like, okay, now what? You know, someone I know actually was the family member of someone who enslaved my family. So it makes you confront history, but you also have to make a decision to discuss it and move forward. And Judge Briscoe welcomed me with open arms. You know, it was just like an uncle. Agnes and John Hanson to me were like brother and sister. Anytime I see them at Sotterley, or anytime I was at an event with Agnes, that relationship between them was genuine. We cannot change history. We cannot hide history. And Agnes and John Hanson, the heart, the passion that they had to preserve historic Sotterley and the stories of all the families that were enslaved there, as well as Agnes Kane Callum, who actually help us to connect to the slave cabin and get it unlocked for the public to view. And her work with John Hanson is just, there's no words to describe the work that John Hanson and Agnes put in on a state, local, and national level. To be able to take something that historically is something people want to hide, people don't want to talk about, people have anger about it. We can't change history. So to see the two of them sit down and work together so that we can know who our ancestors are, what their contributions were. My ancestors weren't just enslaved. The fact that he and Agnes could work side by side to tell both stories. You cannot separate our history, and you can't do that because it's not her history and his history. It's American history. And we all built this country together. Some of us were not in the place that is a place where people want to talk about because of the treatment. You know, there's nothing positive about slavery, but when you can sit at the table and work through it and talk about it and help people to understand that, one, I'm here because my ancestors survived. Would I know that if Agnes and John Hanson had not worked together to preserve historic Sotterley? I don't think I would, because it wasn't in the history books. I'm at a loss for words, because when you see the two of them, my question is, why do we have racial issues? Why do we have racial issues today if those two could get along and talk about something that was horrific? And both of their families were involved in. I don't understand why we can't sit and have that conversation and work through the issues that we have. We also have identities with our ancestors. Everybody's life is worth telling about, you know, and everybody's life has value and worth.
As we're looking at this photograph of Agnes Callum and John Hanson at Sotterley, and being connected with Sotterley as we are, we know what that conversation was. That was groundbreaking decades ago, talking about their shared connection, his great-grandfather owning her great-grandfather, and how much progress had been made since those years ago. I'm going to ask you and Jan pretty much the same question, a variation of what John and Agnes were asked during that interview. How did their efforts together change the dialogue for you and Jan, your ability to have this conversation? And do you think you would have had this conversation today, Jan, this will be for you too, if it weren't for John and Agnes having this conversation decades ago?
I personally don't think that we would, because how do you approach something like that? You know, they set the tone for the descendants at historic Sotterley, because we have to be able to move forward. And I say in love, because if we're angry at each other, nobody's listening. You know, we have to understand the different perspectives from the enslaved as well as the enslaver. There are emotions and feelings tied to those who are ancestors of those who enslaved people who look like me. But the one thing that we also must do is learn that it's not we have to take the focus off of the enslaver sometime and look at my people had a culture, my people had a life before they were brought here. A lot of people focus on the whole subject of the institution of slavery, but these people had lives. These people they may have been considered property, but as somebody said, they were always people. So we also have to look at what was it like for them in the day? You know, how did they celebrate? How did they cook? You know, what things were important to them? Because my ancestors still were able to raise a family. Many families were separated. You know, that's where you see, okay, those, you know, that's, you know, the set of the family from over on that side of town, or we're not related to the family on this side of town. So it's like, Jan and I could not have a discussion if Agnes and John Hanson hadn't set the tone, because we wouldn't be talking about it. It wouldn't be something that, it would still be hidden. It would still be hidden. And I'm thankful that I knew Jan as well as you beforehand, because it didn't make it easier, but it opened the door for us to sit down and have the conversation. Was I supposed to hate Jan now after having an over 10-year relationship with her and her dad? That doesn't make sense. It makes sense for us to acknowledge what happened in the past, because it never should be overlooked. And then to have that dialogue about how do we move forward. A lot of times the ancestors of enslavers have guilt, you know, ancestors of those who were enslaved have anger. Both are part of the cycle of moving towards healing, to move beyond it and set the tone for a brighter future. But we have to communicate, we have to connect. It is our shared history and we have to talk about it. Jan?
Oh, there we go. Well, I will introduce Jan. But thank you, Gwen, for that insight. That was an unrehearsed question, of course, but very significant. So Jan Briscoe, the daughter of John Hanson, my law partner and my wife. But most importantly for this talk, president of the board of Sotterley, and lifelong connection to John Hanson, of course. So Jan, if you would talk about your recollections of your father, but intersperse that with not only his political career, but the connection with Sotterley, if you would.
Sure. Well, this picture represents some of the Briscoe ancestors that lived at Sotterley for a large part of the 1800s. Dad's father, John H.T. Briscoe, was actually the last person to be born in the mansion house. So I was raised knowing that, and Dad certainly, you know, talked about it, but not in much detail. You know, he was frankly so busy. You know, I was 4 years old when he entered politics. And so for most of my childhood, you know, he was a busy guy, you know, going to Annapolis each year, of course, you know, rising in power to become the speaker. Then he became even busier. So his life was very busy between, you know, the law firm and politics. And of course, you know, spent a lot of time with us children as well. Of course, these are pictures of him when he was a little guy in Leonardtown, surrounded by adoring females, including his 3 sisters, his mother. Both of his grandmothers lived with them. So, you know, he was just so loved. He had such a, you know, sort of idyllic childhood in Leonardtown that he always, you know, loved to share stories about when he was a kid. And so obviously, I think is part of the reason why, as everyone has said, why he's always been such a, you know, happy guy, loves people, because he really just had such a, I believe, a really, you know, wonderful upbringing. Of course, he loved baseball and played quite a bit when he was growing up, and then went on to play at Mount St. Mary's College. He was the pitcher of the team, pretty much ruined his arm doing that. And I think it hurt him until the day he died, but he rarely complained about it. But, you know, that was a big part of his life growing up in Leonardtown, playing baseball. And he became lifelong friends with a lot of those guys on that team, I'm sure. And of course, this was a very proud day for all of us when he was sworn in as Speaker of the House of Delegates, one of the very few days we were allowed to skip school and go to Annapolis and see him. That's, of course, my brother John, our mother Sylvia, sister Dana, sister Lisa, and myself. Very special day in our lives. So that was in, I believe, 1973 when he became Speaker. And then, of course, we saw him even less because he was obviously even busier carrying out his duties. But, you know, it was actually, we had fun. He would take us to events, parades, fire department carnivals, church dinners. You know, he included us in his life as a public servant. And, you know, I have fond memories of those years. I really do. And we were, of course, just so very proud of him, knowing he was doing important work. And others have said, you know, we saw how people admired him and didn't mind that wherever we went, people wanted to talk to him. And, you know, that was okay. That was okay. He was just such a great role model for all of us, I think. But as I say, Sotterley at that point was not a big focus in his life because he was just extremely busy, you know, with his career and things. And of course, one of the passions of his life was the environment. And he was very proud of his time serving as chairman of what was then called the Natural Resources Committee. He might have actually even been the first chair, I think. That committee later became Environmental Matters, I think. But that, you know, as others have said, his happy place was being outdoors, fishing, hunting, on his tractor, on the farm, raising cattle. He loved that because I think it was a way for him to escape all the pressures that he had as a public person. And it was probably saved his sanity sometimes. But yeah, he really, and he passed that on to all of us, I think, a love of nature. And certainly whenever he could, he would take us fishing, water skiing, you know, boating. He wanted us to share that love of the natural environment. And again, I know he's very proud of his time passing laws, early laws regarding protection of our environment. That was huge for him. Of course, this is probably after he had retired from politics and was now able to focus more about things in St. Mary's, including, of course, Sotterley, and becoming the president of that board. Here he is with Bonnie and Sandra Van Heerden, who is also another descendant of a prior owner. And he, you know, came to love Sotterley and appreciate it, I think, more as he got older, and learned so much about his own heritage, which he, you know, thanks to Agnes Callum, accepted and wasn't afraid of talking about it, and passed on to us, I think, you know, pride in our heritage, but also, you know, the not to be afraid to be honest about our heritage, all of it, and talk about it. As, you know, Gwen has said, that, you know, it happened. We weren't alive when it happened. I know Agnes always said, you know, John Hanson, you didn't do it. It's not your fault. You know, they became friends and they showed Gwen and I and so many other people that are descendants that we can do this. And, I know he would be so pleased today to see not just me, you know, so many of the family, cousins, siblings are doing work at Sotterley and telling the stories and, you know, working together to try to preserve the place. So I know he would be very happy about that.
Jan, let me stop you for a sec if I can. Chrissy, can you go back to the photo of John and Agnes on the Sotterley lawn? So Jan, as you well know, your dad and Agnes were what we now know were trailblazers in having this discussion on the museum level. This having taken place decades ago. How did this discussion, this moment with Agnes Callum and your dad going national, sharing their shared history, how did that make the conversation easier for you and other descendants? And how has it made it easier for institutions like Sotterley to, other institutions like Sotterley to
Mhm.
have this recognition in this discussion.
Right. Well, clearly, as you said, they were trailblazers doing that when they did so many years ago. And certainly I know gave us, demonstrated that this is okay to talk about. In fact, it's crucial that it be talked about and that we work together to save places like Sotterley because it's not replaceable. This place tells stories. There is no substitute for coming onto a place like that, walking into the slave cabin, and then, of course, walking even into the mansion and seeing, the craft work that was done by incredible, talented enslaved people or laborers. It just tells the whole story of our common history that is so vital to be known and learn from. And as Gwen said so eloquently, so we can show that it can be done. We can get along. We can be open and honest, but in a respectful way, and listen to each other. And we're very lucky that those two did what they did.
Thank you. Yes,
Sam?
thank you. We are very lucky, and we're all the beneficiaries of it. So our next speaker needs no introduction, and will probably get no introduction. It's me. I came down from Baltimore in 1984, knowing absolutely nothing about St. Mary's County, knowing absolutely nothing about Sotterley, did not know that my father-in-law was Speaker of the House or anything. But I lived on the family farm with my wife, Jan, since '84, still on the family farm. And there couldn't have been a better person to introduce me to the county than Jan Briscoe. In thinking about it, Jim Kenney and I have a lot in common. Jim Kenney coming from the Eastern Shore at around the same age that I came down from Baltimore. And the connection with John Hanson really embedded both of us, introduced both of us to this county. Can I have the next picture, Chrissy? So as John, after having known John, I guess for 30 years or so, John was ill, and but gave me an opportunity to interview him, and I did, and learned an awful lot and recorded an awful lot about what he did as a politician, as a lawyer, the family history, his efforts with Sotterley, all of that. He shared it, and I was able to then expand by interviewing people like Nancy and Mike Whitson and Jim Kenney. Gwen, if I didn't interview you, I researched your oral history down at the college. And this county has such a rich history, and John Hanson has such a very rich history. As he told me in one of those interviews, he's had a very blessed life in St. Mary's County. But can I have, Chrissy, the photograph of the Briscoe family on the Sotterley portico? Chrissy.
Give me just a second to find it. Is this the one you're looking for?
No, on the portico, from the 1800s.
Ooh.
We started this talk while they're looking for that photo with Senator Cardin saying that Jan Briscoe appreciated history needed to be preserved. It needed to be told. And when we find this photograph, Chrissy, you've already used this photo once for Jan's presentation.
Yeah, it was a kickoff one for Jan's.
That is Jan Briscoe's grandfather in the lower left. That is Jan Briscoe's great-grandfather, the bearded man on the right. I tried my best to find the identity of the lady in the lower right, and I believe, if my memory serves me, Eliza Plater might have been her name, and she was formerly enslaved at Sotterley. That photograph is on Sotterley's portico. It's the only photograph I know of the Briscoe family. That's the Briscoe history. And Jan Briscoe would have grown up in Southern Maryland, having been born in the 30s. He grew up in a time when this community was segregated and there was discrimination. And, you know, with all of his accomplishments, he became a judge, but his father was a magistrate. So he was following in the family tradition. He was a successful politician, but his father was a successful politician. I think the legacy that will survive his political legacy and his judicial legacy is the legacy. Chrissy, if we can have the photo of John and Agnes now, of the two of them broaching that subject when people across the country weren't talking about this. It was taboo. It was known, but it wasn't spoken. It might have been something that could have been swept under the rug. As Gwen said, if these two had not had that conversation, she might not have that conversation. Jan Briscoe might not have that conversation. Sotterley wouldn't be having the conversation. And as Nancy can attest, because I know it, a lot of museums give Sotterley credit for opening that door, for starting that reconciling discussion that continues today. And as Ben Cardin said very earlier in this talk, that this country needs now more than ever. That, in my opinion, having interviewed John, looked at everything he did, this is the image that will last. This is the most significant contribution I think he made to St. Mary's County, if not the state, and in some respects to the country. And I'm going to leave it at that and turn it back over to our executive director.
Nancy?
Yes.
If you mind, an observation I just wanted to make for a little more context about John's involvement with Sotterley. In the late 1980s, it's impossible to exaggerate what kind of conditions Sotterley was in, both physically and in terms of it had no staff, no programs. And the board asked John and myself and another member of the board, Pat McKenney, to essentially kind of run the place on our own to see if we could make a go at it. And John was fond of telling people at the time, and it was only kind of a joke, that if we didn't do something fairly soon, we're going to call up a local auctioneer, a guy named Rodney Thompson that Jim knows well, and to just try to unload the place. And at the time, John was a judge, and there was only one circuit court judge, and this was in the day there was no security in the courthouse. And I literally would, on a very, very regular basis, sometimes more than once a day, walk across the street and turn right and go up the stairs and go to John's office. And John had a wonderful woman named Mary Farmer who was his secretary. And for a time, Mary would try to kind of keep some decorum there. Let me see if the judge is available. And after the fourth time that week, she'd just say, I'll just go on in. And we just kind of go into John's office. But he literally was running and supervising Sotterley while he was an active circuit court judge. And we had board meetings at Sotterley where we'd have to wait for a few minutes because John was finishing up with a jury trial or something else like that. And he kind of seamlessly put that together. But that was the sort of the depth of his commitment. And just one other final personal observation, Sam, as you talked about John, as we all know, when John, it became clear to him that his days with us were kind of numbered. I had one of the most gracious things I was ever able to do with a friend. He asked me to bring people to see him, and I'm sure you all did that too. I would bring Steady down for an afternoon, or Mike Miller or John Bohannon, and he would sort of think about that. And we'd spend time together looking out at the creek and talking about himself and his life, and in a way that was as genuine and warm and just and if we could all emulate something from him, his ability to appreciate himself and to end his life in that sense, in a way that couldn't have been warmer and more special. And Sam, you just really sort of encapsulated John's importance. So thanks for all that.
Thank you, Michael. Everybody, there's time for people to ask some questions. You are welcome to put them into the Q&A or in the chat. We'll find them no matter where you put them. So please feel free to do that. There have been so many comments for our panelists tonight. about the impact of your words and your stories. But I was struck by the fact that even though in my mind, everybody knows who Agnes and John Hanson are, not everybody knew who Agnes King-Callum was, who were joining us tonight. And Gwen, your elucidation, and then others built this picture and understood. But Michael, I wanted to ask you if you would take another moment, because you were there in 1996 when Sotterley was deemed one of the 11 most endangered historic places in America. And when the two of them stepped up, and Chrissy, if you could find that picture of them in front of the cameras, when some of this was going on, if you could talk a little bit about what you saw between those two and how they stepped up and to try to save not only the physical place, but the stories and the people that place represented.
Sure. Well, like so much of John's work, part of the context there is his friendship with Dick Moe. And Dick was president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And we all had the good fortune that Dick and Julia, who later became vice president, were very involved in Sotterley, lived over in Collier County. So they got engaged with it, but certainly there were at that time the National Trust had a much broader scope and was a more complicated operation. And there were a million places in the country that Dick could have drawn his time and his energy and his attention to, but in large part because of John and John's ability to open that door and say, this isn't just a beautiful place. It isn't just, yes, we need to save the architecture and the history and all of that, but this is why. So John, it's pretty remarkable to look back. This is 30 years ago. So this is to the manor-born Southern Maryland Speaker of the House of Delegates, a judge, and an African-American woman who was an historian and had a remarkable career. And it was seamless the way it happened. There wasn't, everyone has said this, there wasn't anything affected or forced. John didn't decide, well, this is good for business and this is how we needed to do this. It just happened. And you knew that being in board meetings with them, one of the first physical things that we were able to do when we started to find a few dollars to help Sotterley was to protect the slave cabin. And that was not an easy decision on the part of a lot of people. There were a number of folks in the community who just said, well, let's just kind of forget about that. Well, Agnes took us to the slave cabin at a meeting and said, this is our sacred ground and we'll always take care of this. And John said, you're right. I mean, but it happened in a way that was just pure and natural. It wasn't forced at all. So again, I mean, this is what a great picture this is. Here we have these guys and John's involvement with bringing David McCullough there because of Dick Moe and the National Trust. I mean, all those connections, all those pieces, he had a hand in all of those. But again, it was his personality and his sensibilities about how to put things together, put people together in situations that benefited us so greatly, and it still does today.
That had to be just inspiring to witness. And I know I was blessed enough that I got to know both of them. And just what you said, Michael, there was never anything forced between the two of them. In fact, that picture, Gwen, of your beautiful family with John Hanson kneeling there with his hands on Aunt Agnes. That had been how he'd been talking to her. He knelt down, they were having a wonderful conversation. And when they took the picture, he kept his hands there because they were friends. They were friends. And Gwen, you have said this so often that, you know, when you look at other people who are dealing with an acknowledgement of the history, when we're looking at talking and walking common ground, which is this year's theme, we probably wouldn't have been doing this if not for them. And Gwen, tell me I know you said you remember them on the portico. Tell me about your recollections of seeing the two of them together.
To me, it was just like brother and sister. I mean, I call Jan cousin because it just feels like family. You know, I understand the circumstances with which our families were connected are in no means one that anyone would want. But again, we can't change the root of how our families are connected. But what we can do is make sure to nourish that relationship. And it's no different than if I see Lisa or John or anyone else. There's a connection there that you cannot ignore. You know, we survived. You know, it's not that they should look down on their ancestors, because talking about history is not to make anybody be ashamed of the history. What was going on is the way life was lived during that time. The only thing we can do is make sure that we educate people, make them aware of what happened so we don't repeat it, and just empower each other because of it. We encourage each other. I mean, sometimes when Jan and I are talking together, it flows just to me, just like John Hanson and Agnes, no different than what Martina and Jan would speak before me. You know, Martina is Agnes's daughter, for those of you who are unaware, and also her son Martin also sat on the board and served as well. So it is something that with the Briscoe family and their roots, just as I am proud of my ancestors, they are proud of their ancestors. And we together tell that story that is prickly, that is not good to tell, because it doesn't make people feel good about it. But I've always felt Sotterley has been a place where we can talk about it, even if you're uncomfortable. We talk about things with unconditional love. There are other places where there's so much anger and this prickly that you can't have the descendants of both sides speaking together. And that's something they have to work through. They did not have an Agnes or John Hanson. We were blessed to have that. And the relationship you see between those two there, that's the same way that it was. And for those who don't know, Agnes was the one who told John Hanson that her family owned slaves, that his family owned slaves. So it's not that he knew it. He knew of slaves being around, but that wasn't something they bragged on. You know, so it's the point of we must confront our history and we must keep moving forward, because I believe that with our youth today, they don't know the strength of the people that came before them. So therefore, they're all over the place because they don't know their roots. I know my roots, and I've known my roots since 7th grade. So for me, I know that they survived. I know that they endured the institution of slavery. And yet here is my cousin and John Hanson talking together about something that wasn't even talked about in the history books. You know, so my great aunts and uncles going to the site where our ancestors were enslaved, welcomed by the individuals there. Then I do want to say the relationship that we have today at Historic Sotterley is not the same as it was during Sotterley Plantation. I have seen the journey over a 40-year period. We have evolved. We're not there yet, but we're still moving towards a better tomorrow. But it takes everybody. You know, don't talk about the site if you haven't come to the site. You need to experience Historic Sotterley, and you need to be involved. We as descendants, it's not just about putting our name on a paper. It's about also preserving the history of our ancestors. There's work to be done, and we have to roll up our sleeves and we have to get involved, just like the ancestors of those who were enslavers. Both sides need to get together and walk behind John Hanson, or walk with John Hanson and Agnes in the journey that they took. We have a different journey because we're in different times. They didn't have critical race theory to deal with back then, thank God, you know, but I saw a comment flash up about it. But the truth is the truth. You can't change it. Let's talk about it. Let's sit down, but let's do so respectfully. And let's use both ears to listen to each other.
Now, I know our panelists may or may not have been seeing all the comments. There are so many comments, and thanks for this extraordinary panel that has come together tonight. I did, before we close out tonight, want to give each of you a moment to say your last thoughts, or anything that you'd like to conclude on with John Hanson, any little pieces that you may want to mention. So Jim Kenney, let me start with you. Do you have anything after hearing everybody's comments tonight, anything you would like to say about John Hanson?
Yes, I do. Sam asked me, you know, would John have been happy farming? And I indicated I wasn't certain about that. But we've talked about what John has done for Sotterley, and that's certainly very, very true. But I used to kid John a lot. I said, you know, you can only hold a job for about 16 years, and then you've got to move on. And Mike sort of reminded me of something. Sotterley and the project with Agnes really invigorated John, and it brought together an opportunity to try to solve a situation where there were competing interests and competing thoughts. And so in many, many ways, Sotterley and getting to where it is today was very important to John. It gave him, I think, energy and a project that could use his skills to try to bring to fruition. And so I think both of them profited by what has happened.
Thank you, Jim. Certainly all the leadership skills that people had mentioned about him, about trying to bring people together and not try to force things, it was seen so evidently in what he did here. And as you said, in his retirement years, he used those beautiful skills here at Sotterley. And it is one of the reasons with those two remarkable people, while we are still here today. Jan, you want to say a last few words about your dad?
Sure. I just think, again, really almost until the very end of his life, he was genuinely grateful for everything in his life. His friends, he had so many wonderful friends from so many walks of life. And he really cherished his friendships and relationships with people. And of course, his family, his grandchildren, great-grandchildren, his siblings, his nieces and nephews, he loved them all. And I can remember, I think Mike sort of touched on that, just looking out at the water with the sun sparkling on it, that would make his day. He just appreciated those types of things. He did not take them for granted. And I'm very grateful that I got to see that in action, and hope I can even attempt to be like him. And thank you all, by the way, for all of your very lovely words
About your wonderful dad. Gwen, any final words on John Hanson?
Yes. For me, having him to respect my work with children, youth, families, and crime victims, to open that door to build that relationship before Historic Sotterley really helped to know who the man was. And he was kind, and he was gentle, and he was welcoming. And then to find out, the family connection. So while he was helping me to work on behalf of the community, he was also working to help save my history. And through Agnes, I know where part of my ancestors come from. And I am thankful for that tie. And I am thankful that the relationship they had together. And I'm thankful for the interaction that they both had, because they set the tone. And it didn't have to be like that. So to have the courage to talk about a past that is prickly, to work together along what I can only consider to be a force of nature, is the way that I see my cousin Agnes, because it just took great strength to do what she did, because it was during a time that it was not acceptable. So it's a very brave, beautiful, and courageous woman to work along a man, that the passion that they both had, so we can do the work that we're doing today. And history has a heartbeat, and that Historic Sotterley, that is John Hanson Briscoe and Agnes Kane Callum.
Thank you so much, Gwen. Michael, any final thoughts on John? It was somebody who I know was your dear friend and loved you dearly.
Jim's right. It meant a great deal to him. And John's understanding of why it mattered was way, way more than fixing the house that his dad was born in. I mean, at the just most human and warmest level, he recognized how important it was. And it did mean a great deal to him. And so to share that with somebody like that was what a pleasure and what an honor. And so I'm glad I'm here to talk about it.
And Sam, as our moderator, as a man who, thank God, you took the time and put so much about this remarkable man, his legacy, but his interconnections with Sotterley and Agnes, and so much more in this book. I wanted you to have a moment to share any final thoughts about John Hanson.
Well, there's a lot I could say, but I guess it's only fair to put myself through the same unscripted question that I gave Gwen and Jan. And that is the impact of that conversation, that ongoing conversation that Agnes Callum and John Hanson had about their shared relationship and how we should view one another today. And so growing up in Baltimore in the 60s and the 70s, I lived in one type of society where I really only saw white people. That was it. And John Hanson and the conversation with Agnes, it created a lot of bridges, and for the better. My life is for the better because of that conversation that they had. And so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Sam. This was an incredible panel, and I am so grateful to each and every one of you, and of course to Senator Cardin, who was here earlier with us, to share memories and bring this remarkable person to life. As said by each of the panelists tonight, you know, as you remembered this kind, dear man, and you saw this relationship with this woman who, for any other two people, that friendship wouldn't have been there, and that leadership of what was to become. And I think somewhere up there, they're looking down and seeing our Descendants Project with over 200 self-identified descendants helping guide and lead this organization forward to the work that we need to do. And knowing they were the start of it all, I think they would both be smiling. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. There were huge thanks in the chat for everything that you shared with us tonight. Do know that there will be another very wonderful in-person event coming up in just a week and a half. It's going to be down at St. Mary's College of Maryland. Whispers from the Water, we are going to be screening the movie that is on Netflix currently called Descendant. We're going to have panelists after the screening of the movie from that were actually diving on the slave ship, descendants of the Clotilda, panelists, some of our descendants, as well as panelists from the college. It will be a wonderful in-person event. You just need to register, and you can do that through our website or through the college. So for tonight, thank you one and all for joining us. Thank you to our panelists. It was, in fact, a wonderful evening to remember an absolutely incredible man. Thank you all so much, and have a great evening.
Good night.
Good night. Good night.